Okay, well, we've hit 11:02, and so thanks for that reminder, Joseph. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on civic science, and I'm Steve Young. I'm a retired 30 plus year EPA employee. Um, been involved to some degree with biodiversity informatics for over 20 years now, I guess almost 30 years. It depends on how you count. I'm also, after I retired, I became a master naturalist, which kind of tracks with much of our topic for this morning. So I will mention that too. I wanted to talk a little bit about nomenclature just briefly. So most people have heard the term citizen science. Other terms have also been used, community science. I think that there was some pushback about citizen science, that might have unintended implications about who's participating. So community science has been used, and parts of the federal government, including EPA, said we're going to use the term participatory science, which that's a good descriptor because we are talking about a very participatory process, but participatory doesn't exactly flow off the tongue readily. That's 6 syllables. That's a lot of syllables. So more recently, civic science has been emerging as an alternative term. And I admit I like it because it rolls off the tongue much more readily. It's alliterative, um, fewer syllables. So for our purposes, we're going to use civic science, but it's pretty much synonymous with the other terms. And of course, it also has major elements of crowdsourcing, another term that most people are familiar with. So clearly, in recent years, technologies like our phones have enabled all sorts of innovative new efforts, and we're seeing a huge proliferation of civic science type efforts. And I do want to remind people there's a document in the folder for this session. And Joseph, maybe we can put in a link to the session folder also. But some interesting other civic science efforts are mentioned in the document, including efforts associated with ESIP's 3 major sponsoring federal agencies, USGS, NASA, and NOAA. I really like USGS a number of years ago came out with the Did You Feel It um, uh, web page. Basically, I'm not sure that there's an app, but essentially when there's an earthquake, people can report whether they felt the earthquake and how intensely uh, they felt the shaking from the quake. And that's actually provided some really interesting data about quakes, including differences in how earthquakes propagate in the East Coast versus the West Coast. So, some actual kind of interesting science coming out of that. Um, NOAA was a pioneer in what you could call crowdsourcing or now civic science for weather related uses. Weather spotters reporting rainfall, snowfall, like Steve was talking about 11 inches of snow where he is in New Orleans. Um, so they've done a lot of pioneering work, certainly in the weather domain. And NASA has kind of an overarching initiative that's been underway for a number of years now called Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment, GLOBE. And under that umbrella, they have quite a few interesting initiatives. So if you look at the resources document in the folder that Joseph linked to, you can see, I think, quite a few interesting um, initiatives, some of which may be new to you. And I will mention birds have been a hotspot in the civic science space. Many of you may have heard of eBird in particular. There's a number of other really cool things related to birds. But I will defer to Steve Fulmer to talk more about why biodiversity is such a phenomenal domain for civic science. I'll also throw out there's a criteria document in the folder that just suggest some criteria if you're looking at an initiative, ways to think about that initiative. And finally, I'm going to say we're seeing a lot of innovative initiatives that are making genuine impacts. That was sort of the theme of this ESIP meeting, from innovation to impacts. We are seeing genuine impacts, expanding our knowledge of biodiversity and enabling better informed conservation efforts. So I'm going to close with a little story, and let me see if I could successfully share my screen here. I hope. Hopefully you can see this now.
Yeah.
I'm going to. Excellent. Okay. So ESIP had its summer meeting in Asheville, North Carolina back in July. And this is a little true story about an interaction between ESIP and iNaturalist. Oh, it's not advancing for, oh, I know why. I think I know why. Sorry. There we go. I was sitting in one of the ESIP sessions when Dave Jones of ESIP, who was sitting behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Steve, there's a bug on your shoe." And it turned out that this beetle had decided to visit the session, and it had walked down the aisle and it apparently made a beeline for me and climbed onto my shoe, catching Dave's attention. And as I watched, it proceeded to start climbing up my pants leg, thus the picture on the left. And I was very excited because it was a cool looking beetle and I like beetles. So, of course, I took a picture with my phone. I did take the beetle outside where the second picture was taken and released it unharmed back to the wild. But it felt like something that I call "I-Nat me, Steve." I've had quite a few experiences where it seems like an organism presents itself to me and in effect says, "I want to be an INAT." So I did promptly enter an observation in iNaturalist, and we're going to hear a lot more about that from Carrie shortly. And within several minutes, I knew that it was a metallic tiger beetle. And a couple more minutes, I was able to narrow it down to a Virginia metallic tiger beetle. And the observation that I created went into the global database. So that was one more data point for an occurrence of this particular beetle. And this is research grade, globally accessible information. So I just think that kind of capability is super cool. And it was very fun that this happened at last summer's ESIP meeting. But with that, I am going to turn the microphone over to Steve Formel. And let me introduce you, Steve, for just a sec. He's a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Science Analytics and Synthesis Program. He's the node manager for the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, USA, OBIS, USA, and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF US, GBIF US. And he supports other efforts related to species observation and biodiversity. He's a microbial biologist by training, with his past research focusing on the relationship between a saltgrass, its microbiome, and a Deepwater Horizon oil spill. More recently, he's turned his attention toward improving data management and standards implementation for large, complex data and projects. And Steve's going to talk about why biodiversity is such a great domain for civic science efforts. So Steve, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So first, I want to make sure I say thanks to Steve for putting the session together, and also for Megan Orlando to matching us up. And then the other person that deserves thanking is Abby Benson, who unfortunately couldn't attend this meeting, but Abby not only helped connect us, she developed the initial ideas with us, and And I think Abby also deserves credit, as she was the predecessor for me in this position as node manager of GBIF and OBIS. And she was also the person who kept telling me to use iNaturalist till I finally used it. And then, of course, like many people, I was like, this is amazing. I can't believe I didn't do this sooner. So Abby deserves credit for finally pushing me over the edge with iNaturalist.
Hardly
Um,
agreed that Abby deserves a lot of credit for this. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Okay, cool. So, Steve, can you give me a thumbs up? You can see my title screen here, or my title slide.
Looks good, Steve.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, there's a pretty natural connection between biodiversity science and civic science, and I'm going to just sort of give some examples and a few discussion points related to that. I learned a lot in participating in the session already and putting together this talk, and so I'm not trying to present myself as an expert on citizen science or civic science, um, but um, but I do think it's a pretty exciting frontier of science, and especially biodiversity science. Um, Starting out here, I'm just showing a map of the data that's within GBIF, for the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. This represents over 3 billion observations of biology. So some of those points might be single occurrences, and others might be, a flock of birds or a school of fish, something like that. We're going to talk about this map a little bit more later, but I wanted to give you a sense that there's a lot of data out there. And so I'm going to start by giving some background on these two different international initiatives, because while I deal with them every day, not everyone is aware of them. The first is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, and that's at gbif.org. And I see Joseph kindly sharing the links in the chat. And the second is the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. I think there's two key take homes here that you should remember. One is that there's a ton of data in both of these systems that are available for you to freely reuse and do science with. And the second thing is that these are really international initiatives that are built on people. So they're sort of most famous for their data aggregation, but they're really these international communities. And I'm going to give you some more details about that. But I really wanted to emphasize that point, that in my opinion, the success of these and their utility comes from the people, not the people more than the data. So here's a map of how these networks shake out over the planet. So if there's a country that's colored gray, that's where there is at least one GBIF node. In the United States, we have many. We're such a large scientific community. We have several nodes, and then also many publishers and various other types of participants. And then where there's a black dot, that's where there's an OBIS node for that country. And in some cases, it might be thematic. So within the United States, we have 3 different OBIS nodes: OBIS USA, Fish OBIS, and then also Deep Sea OBIS, OBIS CMAP. And then just finally, I wanted to sort of ping that we do specific things here in the United States related to these initiatives. So there are secretariats for GBIF is in Denmark, and for OBIS is in Belgium. So these are intergovernmental initiatives, but here within the United States, we have, of course, our own needs and priorities. And so my job is to make sure that that what is going on in these initiatives is working well for the scientific community. And if the scientific community in the United States needs help with any of this, whether it's finding data or publishing data, I'm the person that they can work with. So keep that in mind, that if you ever have questions about these things, you're free to reach out to me, and I will be happy to work with you. So GBIF US and OBIS USA are managed by the US Geological Survey. I'll talk about their funding sources in a second, but I guess I've already sort of covered these talking points. The main thing to understand is that we try to make these things useful for the United States public, and we are here to help if you have questions. One of the confusing things about these two is that there's a lot of overlap and similarities in what they do. So both are active and energetic communities that develop and maintain and promote standards and practices for biodiversity science. They're both about 25 years old now. So really, represent successful large-scale science initiatives. They promote not just biodiversity science, but open biodiversity science, and publish massive amounts of data through their platforms. There's an active joint action plan that they have signed, and I'm part of that, working to make sure that we're trying to make the the experiences of using their data and working with them as seamless as possible. And then an important thing to know if you're working with their data is that they're built on the same data and metadata standards, and they share a lot of the same open source tools. So there's really a huge effort here to make information as fair and interoperable as possible. So important differences is GBIF has a global scope, whereas OBIS includes marine occurrences only. And this is in part driven by their funding sources. So GBIF has contributions from individual countries. So in our case, the National Science Foundation contributes money for the United States to be a voting member of GBIF. And then the USGS, we manage our node. And then for OBIS, it's a program under UNESCO. And so it's responding to funding for the United Nations and UNESCO in terms of how what budget it has and how it allocates those funds. One thing to note about the United States is we're a bit unusual in two ways. One is that we manage that the same people that I manage both of GBIF and OBIS in one place. In some countries, they're two distinct management offices. And then the other one is we're such a massive country, both with respect to geography and resources and the size of our scientific community, that we're quite heterogeneous. And so in some countries, there's a very clear pipeline to how you work with these initiatives. But in our case, there's a lot of different ways that you can work with the data, whether you're finding data or publishing data. And it gives us a lot of advantages, but can also cause some murkiness as to what exactly you should be doing. Okay, so that brings us back to this map and the question, why does biodiversity science need civic science? So again, this is a map of the data that's within GBIF. Just to show an example, OBIS would look somewhat similar. And I want you to focus on these purple regions in the ocean, and then this sort of dark green regions on the land. Those are areas where there is absolutely no data. No data within this database. And those regions are quite large still, especially within the oceans. So the point is we just don't have enough data in most places in the world to really assess biodiversity. But importantly, again, here I'm using GBIF as a representative, but this is very similar for how OBIS works. These communities and platforms are already tools to integrate citizen science efforts. And so this is just sort of an overview of the workflow of how data starts on the left with all sorts of people and uses open standards and licenses to publish to a central place, which can then feed data to all sorts of people for all sorts of uses on the right. And so again, just wanting to note here, it's called citizen science, but civic science is very much a part where it can be published and used side by side along with traditional academic data and government data, museum data, business data, etc. And a big question, of course, is why would civic scientists bother with this? I found this nice study from the Netherlands, which tried to quantify this with a few thousand, by surveying a few thousand people. And I think it's quite telling that the reasons that civic scientists do what they do are very similar to the reasons that most of us as scientists do what we do. So sort of like meaning like professional scientists. So for whatever reason, we're drawn to, we want to be connected to nature. We want to learn more about nature and contribute to conservation and management. We enjoy spending time outdoors. We think we're good at it. It gives meaning to our lives. We like working together with other people. So I think there's a lot of commonalities, and it's just sort of traditional, biases that exist in science as a professional enterprise that have made civic scientists seem as if they're operating in a separate sphere. All right, so who can be a civic scientist? And of course, the answer is pretty much anybody. In fact, not pretty much anybody can be a civic scientist. And I'm highlighting a few things that I'm excited about here on this slide. So in the top left here is this really cool effort from Denmark called Insectmobilen or Insectmobile. And it's essentially they tried different ways of people just driving or riding their bike, or I suppose some of them are walking and skateboarding and things too. Transects on roads where they were just collecting insects in nets and then reporting out on that. it's worth reading about. It's not that everything came out perfectly in terms of being the best way to collect data, but it's remarkable the efficiency with which they were able to collect data. So that's one worth investigating. On the upper right is CrowdMag. This is one of the, it's not a biodiversity civic science effort per se, but it's one that I'm always impressed by the innovation and success of it, where essentially a map or an app was created where people can turn it on their phones, and that helps monitor the magnetosphere around the planet Earth. And I believe there are some e-sippers that were involved in that. On the bottom left is me as an iNaturalist. So I'm a biologist for the United States Geological Survey. In that sense, I'm a professional biologist, and I'm really good at data management. I'm really good at thinking about statistics and data science and things like that. I'm a pretty mediocre naturalist, if I'm going to be honest. I like plants. I'm okay with plants. Insects, I need some help with. Um, Other types of organisms, maybe I'm good to family or genus, but not much beyond that. And most importantly, it's a way for me to work with my family um, to help enjoy the outside world together. So, for example, we frequently use iNaturalist when we're walking on the levee here on the Mississippi River. And when I started using iNaturalist, I was really impressed to discover that what had looked like just the grass that is regularly mowed on the levee turned out to have a diversity of something like, I think I was able to catalog something like 30 or 40 different plants on that in that mowed area alone. So really, it's opened up my, acting as a civic scientist outside of my professional scientist duties has really allowed me to do other types of contributions than I normally would do in the course of my career. In the bottom middle is a young person working on the UNESCO eDNA expeditions. Here, this picture is in Mauritius. This is a really interesting effort. I'll share a slide on it later, but a cool way to bring this cutting edge technology to school children. There was about 250 school children that participated in that. And then in the bottom right, another favorite one that hits close to home. This is the Bucket Brigade, which you may have heard about in southern Louisiana, in a place known as Cancer Alley. These are people who designed a way for the community to monitor air pollution in their areas and collect data that stands up to EPA standards and allows them to make headway on issues about environmental justice in their communities. Okay, so having highlighted some of those, I think it's clear that civic science is already happening. And there was this nice statistic from a paper cited here on the right-hand side that in 2007, citizens or civic science only accounted for about 11% of GBIF occurrence data, but is now as much as 65% in 2020. And so the point is it's growing faster, or at least just as fast as contributions from professional science. And a large part of that is iNaturalist and eBird. Those are two of the biggest contributors to GBIF. But it's not just those. And again, I'm going to show some examples in a little bit. In researching this presentation, I came across this paper that I thought did a nice job sort of describing the frontiers of civic science. And generally speaking, they identified these three areas. One is using citizen science to increase representation of undersampled regions and taxa. For a lot of people, that's sort of the most obvious use, I think, of civic science. Another is developing pipelines for estimating species abundance in space and time. This is an area where maybe civic scientists can contribute their technical skills that are not necessarily related to collection directly. And then finally, capitalizing on secondary data collection. There's a lot of really interesting scenarios in which people are reusing data and getting more information out of them, and can do so, again, from the comfort of their homes or in their sort of non-professional life. So the first example I want to share, this is a screenshot from OBIS, which is this marine database for coordinating, in this case, invasive information in the Mediterranean Sea. And so they've been able to develop decision-making tools to help countries in the Mediterranean understand the extent of invasion of different species, so that they can respond to it in a timely and effective manner. So what this is representing a coordination of information from various diving networks that contribute to OBIS. A specific example of this is an identification of a shrimp scad from the Sea Watchers Marine Citizen Science Platform back in 2012. well before any professional scientists had identified that the SCAD was being found far west in the Mediterranean. A citizen scientist was able to point that out, and again, sort of mobilize the response to having seen that. Lionfish are another good example of invasive species being strongly tracked and helpfully tracked by civic science. Okay. We've talked about that there's huge data gaps, and this is an example of civic science helping to fill those data gaps. Tunisia in Tunisia organizes many different civic science efforts. For this one, they had done some diving and some observation and created a single data set which observed 12 species that had not previously been reported in Tunisia. So again, just this group of people in the center helped pull things together and really increase our understanding of the biodiversity in the seas of Tunisia. Previously, I had mentioned eDNA expeditions from UNESCO. So OBIS was a big part of this, where they developed these kits and invited, I said, about 250 school children, I don't remember across how many countries, to go and sample the oceans in their area and then use environmental DNA to assess the biodiversity in that area. There is a link explaining the outcomes, or sort of describing the outcomes of the success of this work, which wrapped up last year. I'll throw that in the chat in a little bit. But I think, here it's really interesting that we were able to take something that is seen as a cutting edge technology and have, school children who are still trying to figure out where they're going in life be the ones who are operating and discovering these data that then helped inform multiple countries about the biodiversity of their oceans. And finally, capitalizing on secondary data. So iNaturalist is a great example of primary data where, I might go out and say, oh, cool, look, here's a bird that I'm taking a picture of, or an insect, or a fish, or whatever. But in many of those cases, there's secondary information that others can go in and annotate for additional occurrences. So for example, maybe there's other fish than the one that was the original focal point, or the phenology world is definitely mining iNaturalist images these days to understand not only what plants are there, but when they're in flower and that sort of stuff. There's a really famous example of a rare leaf miner being recognized in a plant leaf from, I think it was an iNaturalist photo. The point is there is just tons of information out there waiting to be reused, waiting to be sort of built upon, and there's nothing holding back civic scientists from participating in this information. Essentially, there's more data than we have people to work on. And lastly, being that ECIP has a strong federal agency component, I wanted to highlight citizenscience.gov, which was something that Abby pointed out to us as we were starting to plan this session. I had not heard of it, but it turns out, of course, that there is this great resource for helping us understand how citizen science is being used by the federal government, and also helping to plan any efforts that we might have interest in. So I won't go into more details, but it's worth checking out. There's a great catalog on there highlighting different government projects, and I hope that you find that useful. And with that, I hope I didn't go too long, Steve. Sorry if I did, but now I'll pass it over to Carrie, I guess.
You're good, Steve. Thanks. Thank you very much for that presentation. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce Carrie Seltzer. She works for iNaturalist, a social platform that connects millions of people, literally, to nature and advances biodiversity science and conservation. The iNat community continuously uncovers new and lost species and has generated one of the largest openly accessible data sets of biodiversity that is used extensively in research. As the head of engagement and part of the iNat leadership team, Carrie works to expand the impact and reach of iNat. Prior to joining iNat, she was a science and technology policy fellow with AAAS at the National Science Foundation, where she worked on open data policy. She has a BA from Earlham College and a PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And this is very fun. where she studied seed dispersal ecology and choreographed an interpretive dance of seed dispersal by giant pouched rats for the 2012 Dance Your PhD competition. That must have been a lot of fun. So with that, Carrie, let me turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation, Steve. And thank you, Stephen, for the awesome context setting and really great overview of what's happening more broadly in the field. And, before I start sharing my screen, actually, can we go back to the view where I can see everybody? Because I want to do a quick poll of the audience that will help me understand um, a little bit about all of you and your familiarity with iNaturalist already. I've recognized a couple of names in the audience, but I would love to see if you can use the is there yeah, there's
There's
like
a
the raise hand function. Maybe could people just use that if you're already using iNaturalist. If you've got an iNaturalist account, can you raise your hand? This will just help me see a few. Okay, cool. Okay, a few people, but not a ton of people. That's awesome and very helpful. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I will switch to start sharing my screen now. And can you see it?
yes, looks good.
Cool. You can put your hands back down now if you haven't already. So thanks everyone. I've got a QR code here if anyone wants to try our new app. Um, I'll mention it. I think I might have this QR code later too, and I can put a link in chat if folks are interested. So don't feel rushed to have to scan this, especially if you're on your phone. I'll get you a link. But it's my great pleasure to to introduce many of you to iNaturalist. And for those of you who know a little bit already, hopefully you will learn something new today. So, as Steve already set up, right, we know that there are immense challenges for biodiversity with climate change and habitat destruction. There are so many species under threat. And we really see this as it's a multi-pronged problem, but especially we think about these two pieces of needing both engaged people as well as the information to guide effective conservation if we're going to protect biodiversity in the way that we need to. And as you saw in the previous presentation, we still have a ton of gaps. So we want to get more people in more places, recording more species, so we have the insights that we need and the people we need to make change happen to protect biodiversity. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of iNaturalist, then dig a little more into how iNaturalist works, talk about our scale and reach, and then innovations, and then we'll have hopefully about a half an hour left for questions overall, and I have plenty of bonus slides if needed. So for starters, we think about what we're doing with iNaturalist as building a global movement for biodiversity because we want to see everybody outside taking pictures of moss like my colleague Amanda's doing here. One way to think about this is that we build the way that we're trying to get people outside is that we build scalable technology that helps people learn about biodiversity and crowdsource data globally on all species. We're interested in everything living and recently living. We're a nonprofit organization based in the US. It was launched as a master's project in 2008 and it's still growing. And on a weekly basis, we share data with GBIF. Like I mentioned, we've got these sort of two main areas. One is engaging people with nature and empowering anyone online to explore and contribute to research. And two, we want to accelerate biodiversity, science, and conservation, and we are because we've got the world's most diverse and dynamic data set on biodiversity that is available for science, and it's also powering grassroots projects. I'll give a couple of examples of those later. So especially for those of you who are unfamiliar with how iNaturalist works, we've got millions of people out there using our mobile apps, using our website, and they see a photo of a butterfly, take a picture, upload it to iNaturalist. Then we've got hundreds of thousands of people who are adding identifications. So even if you don't know what you saw, you can post it to iNaturalist and think of that as the invitation to a conversation about what you saw. And through this process of people sharing their observations and people identifying observations, collectively, we're crowdsourcing the most diverse and dynamic set of biodiversity data. Our platform consists of both a website as well as our mobile apps available on iOS and Android. We also have an app called Seek by iNaturalist that I should have asked about Seek too. If there's any Seek fans, please drop that in chat. But Seek is more focused on the sort of personal experience of getting a quick answer from a computer vision model, and less on the contribution to science. But there's sort of all this suite of sharing observations and building this habit of paying attention to nature. Lastly, we have an API and open data like what we share with GBIF that I mentioned earlier. There have been a couple of examples of other people's observations already, but I'll share mine. And this is an observation of a moth that flew into the GBIF booth at COP16, the UN biodiversity meeting that happened in Cali, Colombia in October. And this shows you the key aspects of data that we capture in iNaturalist. Photos are the evidence of what you saw. There's who you are, which you can have a pseudonym. I have my real name. Um, where you were with coordinates, as well as when you observed it, and also when it was submitted. So with those bits of data, then you can start with a general identification. Like in this example, I knew it was some kind of sphinx moth, but I didn't know what kind. So I posted it as a sphinx moth, then someone else came and identified it to species not very long after, which was pretty exciting. We also have these additional fields called annotations. These are sort of optional, and you can either add them yourself or someone else can help by adding them. But things like life stage for insects can be especially helpful for understanding phenology and things like that. And we've also got, if you sort of keep scrolling down the page of the view of this on the website, we have this section called the data quality assessment. And this is where people can flag if there's data quality issues or concerns. Like, for example, it says that it was recorded in, 1970, but obviously there's a cell phone in the photo. Like, you can flag it as the date is not accurate. If you see that it's posted from the middle of the ocean and it doesn't look like it was in the middle of the ocean, you can flag the location is inaccurate. We're especially focused on wild organisms, and so we have a flag here. We want to know if it is not wild. Was it in a zoo? Is it a pet? Is it a garden plant? We want to make sure that that's indicated appropriately. Also, sometimes people submit things that just don't really have evidence of an organism, right? Random photos. And this is intended, if it's not recent, this is so we can sort of filter out fossils and things like that. So this is one way that we have quality control on the other aspects of the observation data separate from the identification. Once something has this research grade status where it's been confirmed by at least 2 people at the species level, that's when we'll share it with GBIF and it gets a little badge. So the reason that iNaturalist can have this crowdsourcing process of going from a much more general identification, even starting with something as non-specific as plants, is because we have a single underlying taxonomy. This also makes iNaturalist a great place for people who are both specialists in a specific area of interest, as well as more generalist naturalists or just curious people who maybe are looking at a little bit of everything, interested in a little bit of everything. I think this has been one of the things that has really helped iNaturalist take hold and grow dramatically, is because we have this something for everyone who's interested in nature, and by having this single connected tree, it allows for this crowdsourcing process. It's also possible to create projects on iNaturalist, and we have a few 100,000 projects on iNaturalist that have been created to bring people together with various, either in common places or under common interests. Sometimes these are used in classrooms, all sorts of reasons. The phenomenon of a BioBlitz, which is, you can think of, sometimes people call it a flash mob for nature. It might be you focus on a park, you invite people for an afternoon, and the goal is to just try and find as many species in that park as possible on that day. So this is another thing that has really helped iNaturalist be more broadly useful, and really helps other organizations fulfill their missions by using iNaturalist in part. So we've got more than 200 million, I think it's more than 230 million now, observations globally. This heat map shows that we've got pretty good coverage across North America, and increasingly in Europe as well as, and in addition to some major areas in the Southern Hemisphere. It's increasingly popular in Australia, New Zealand, Southern Africa, especially South Africa, and you can see some other hotspots really, really pop out there too. But clearly, there are so many incredibly biodiverse parts of the world where we don't have nearly enough people involved yet. One of the ways that we have been able to grow in different parts of the world has been through partnering with different types of organizations in different places. In some places we work with a university, and others it's a small nonprofit. Sometimes it's a sort of Ministry of the Environment type government entity. It's widely variable, but in each of these places we have a partner who is especially invested in promoting iNaturalist, both its use and popularizing it, as well as helping ensure that the data can be used for research and conservation in their areas. Of course, this wouldn't be possible without a lot of translation. So the iNaturalist interface has been translated into dozens of languages. We use a platform called Crowdin. If anyone's interested in helping with this process, I'm happy to drop some links in there. What this all adds up to is this exciting real-time global collaboration. So in the time that we're talking, we'll probably have at least 5,000 observations posted and at least 12,000 identifications. And what this globe shows is the orange is the location of the observation, and then the white line is connecting where the identification has come from approximately. So you can see that there's a lot of activity that happens within regions, but there's also a lot of expertise that's being shared around the globe. iNaturalist has grown dramatically since its start in 2008, which isn't even on the graph here. This is as of about October, I think. So we're right now in a little valley that looks like this, because iNaturalist is very seasonal in terms of its peaks and valleys, which is driven by the Northern Hemisphere spring and summer, and winter is our, as you might expect, our calmest least active time. When it comes to iNaturalist data being used beyond iNaturalist, the best way that we have visibility into that is through the data set that we share with GBIF, because then GBIF provides DOIs for each download, and then ideally those DOIs are cited and then that can be traced back to iNaturalist. And so if you look at all the publishers that share data with GBIF, iNaturalist has more than 5,000 citations, which is the most of any of the GBIF data publishers. iNaturalist also has a real standout number of species. eBird also produces a massive amount of data that's shared with GBIF, but there's only about 10,000 bird species, and we're sharing almost 400,000 species with GBIF. And on an annual basis, we're recording well over 100,000. I think in 2024, it was over 300,000 unique species. So there's really nothing else out there right now that can census so many species on such a quick time scale. And for images too, iNaturalist, about half of all of the images shared with GBIF are from iNaturalist. And if you limit that to just this past decade, it goes up to almost 3/4. So iNat's a really important source of images for open in the context of open biodiversity data. Just like many hands make light work, our philosophy is that many eyes make good data. So anyone can add identifications on iNaturalist, and we've got many examples of enthusiastic folks developing expertise through the course of using iNaturalist. But a question we get a lot is, is your data bad? So last year we did a series of experiments to assess that, and what we found in these experiments is that if you look at just our research grade subset of observations, which are the ones we're sharing with GBIF, we found that 1% are incorrectly labeled. That's these. And we have a few percent that are uncertain. We don't know if they're correct or not, but we have about 95% correctly labeled, correctly identified research grade data. If you look at the observations that are still in the pool that we call needs ID, the percentage correct goes drops considerably, closer to 80%, with many more mistakes, as well as a lot more uncertainty as well. So as you might expect, if you're looking for the highest quality data, looking at the research grade data, but knowing that there are, of course, still always going to be mistakes. But I think one of the beautiful things about iNaturalist is that they can always be corrected. Some of you who work with ArcGIS may have noticed or may be excited to learn that you can now view many iNaturalist observations through the ArcGIS Living Atlas. And we'll actually be talking, if anyone's going to be at the Esri Federal Users Conference next month, I'll be there. So maybe I'll see you again. This last main section, I'll just mention some of our innovations. One of the things we've been able to do with having millions of labeled images is train a computer vision model to give you suggestions based on visual similarity. So here's a violet that I took a photo of in my neighborhood here in DC. And you can see that I've got several species level suggestions as well as a genus level recommendation. So this is what it looks like in our existing iOS app right now. So we try to sort of, we call it a roll up, right? Like could be one of these few species, but we're pretty confident that it's in this genus. So this can provide a useful starting place if you have no idea what you're looking at. We also have been able to, in the same way that we train this computer vision model, we've taken the same set of data and trained a geo model. And we use this to help distinguish between things that are visually similar. I think that's my next slide. But basically, we've got almost 100,000 species. We're going to pass 100,000 species next month that we're training this geo model for, as well as this computer vision model. We're also working on getting out these sort of range map predictions. We expect to iterate on that. We know that our first pass of it is going to be far from perfect, but we're really excited to start getting this information out there for use beyond iNaturalist as well. So here's exactly what I was just mentioning. We've got two species of lizard that look very similar, right? Hard to tell apart visually, but they have non-overlapping ranges. So given a point in Nebraska here, even if it looks like this one, we know that it's got to be this one because of the distribution. So we found that combining both the visual similarity and the geo model gives us about an additional 10% accuracy. So we're updating these models about once a month, and each time we update, we compare the previous model to the new model, and we're looking across these graphs to see if we're substantially losing ground in any of these taxonomic areas or any of these geographic areas, because each time we train a new model, we're adding, you know, a few thousand new species. So we're trying to make sure that we're still overall increasing accuracy as we give it more and more possible options that can come out. It's been really cool to see how our active community of of observers and identifiers has come to anticipate and look forward to these updates that are happening about once a month. So these are a few of the comments that people have made when we've released new models, saying things like, "Nice, some of the spiders I've been working on made it to the new model. Thanks for the regular update." Things like that. Each time we update, we do a blog post and we have a link where you can click to see what are the new species that got added in that model. The other cool thing that we can do with this geo model is that we can use it to detect anomalies. So this is a way for us to find things that might be unusual observations, or potentially just flag things that are misidentified. And this is an example of a invasive elm zigzag sawfly that popped up in Minnesota. It's been spreading throughout the eastern United States, but our geomodel did detect it as an geographically unusual observation in Minnesota. So we did a little story about that. Another sort of proof of concept here is the Joro spider that's been spreading mainly around Georgia, but is now popping up in other places. So this highlights examples of where the geomodel has picked up that these Joro spider observations are there, but they're aberrant. And like I mentioned right at the beginning, we're working on a new mobile app, and especially those of you who are not already using iNaturalist, I'm especially interested in your perspectives on this. If you scan this QR code, I'll try to drop the link in chat once I'm done talking. You can download our new app. It's only available on iOS right now, but we're really interested in your feedback. There's a feedback button. If you click into this menu, we review that feedback once a week. That's the best way to give us feedback. And we want to know what's confusing, what do you like, what do you hate, all those things. Please let us know. And things might be broken, they might be buggy. It's in very active development right now. And I think I've ended pretty much right on time, so we should have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks, Carrie. That was fabulous. Thank you very much. Just a couple of comments or reactions. One is I don't think you mentioned audio observations, but that's a capability that INAT added that I think is very important, especially, as sort of a birder, that often those of you who bird know you hear the bird, but you don't see the bird. And INAT can now accept audio observations as well as the image observations. So that's kind of a cool
Yeah.
thing.
Thanks,
And
Steve. I'll just interject to say, we've got iNaturalist is far less, it's only like 0.5% or less sound observations. We just passed 1 million sound observations, but you can record sound. We can't, however, do anything clever with it yet. So you can record it and you can submit it, but we don't have, it's not like the Merlin app. If any of you use Merlin, which if you don't, you should.
yeah,
But we can't tell you like we can with images. We can't tell you that for sounds, but we are hoping to do that. We're waiting to see if we get some dedicated funding for that project.
yeah, I hope you do. And I think I've asked this question before. I know you hear from people, oh, it'd be so cool if I could submit video, um, especially when there's an interesting behavior going on by an organism. So is there anything you can say about that? I know it costs money, but
Yeah, it's also a moderation nightmare.
mm,
So we don't have any plans to move in the direction of video anytime soon. Sometimes people will also upload a video to YouTube and then post a link as a comment or as a note in the observation, and that that's the best we can suggest for now.
which is helpful. Thanks, Carrie. I see Steve asked, what's the best way to ask a question? Let's try the raise hand technique first. And this is open to everybody. So if you have a question for Carrie, if you have a question for Steve, if you have a general question, it's open to all. So Kelsey, I saw your hand go up briefly. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I didn't. That was just for my participation in iNaturalist.
Okay. Now got it.
But Steve
Steve,
has a hand up.
I see that. Steve.
I do. Yeah, Carrie, we might have to have a meeting after this so we can, talk shop about all the cool ways we could collaborate, especially within the United States. That was really informative. I learned a lot. Like I said, I'm a relative newcomer to iNaturalist. So I have a couple questions. I'll just throw them all out there and then you can answer them in whatever order you want. The first is I wonder if you could, sort of, is there a key difference between the new app and the old app in terms of why it was developed? And then the second question is, one of the things I really admire about civic science in general, but especially the iNaturalist platform, is the ability to have community feedback on data quality, which is something that we're really bad at as professional scientists. And within the GBIF world, we're constantly debating this. How do we, when a grad student takes the time to comb through somebody else's data, increase the quality of it, and then, make some sort of derivative analysis? Often that work is left on the cutting room floor. They have no way to feed it back to the original publisher and make sure that the data gets improved. Has there ever been any discussion of that as sort of technology transfer? iNaturalist bringing that, transparent review system to like museums and things like that? So sorry, two questions. So the app and then the data quality review system.
Okay. Maybe I'll just answer the data quality review one first, because I think that the short answer is no. I don't recall having any specific conversations with whether or not there's like, I mean, I think it's iNaturalist is so bespoke that like I don't think anyone would want to like reuse our code, but certainly I think there's lessons you could take from that. And it's complicated and maybe most difficult, like you, at least in the way that we do it with crowdsourcing identifications, you have to have one taxonomy, and that's really hard. taxonomy is really hard. Probably most of you have some intimate familiarity with how difficult that is. Yeah. So to the app,
Yeah.
what, or do you want to clarify?
Well, just
Or
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think maybe it's more that conceptually, like I get that like technically it might not be a sort of easy thing to just hand over, but conceptually there's a lot of strength to what you all do. And I think it's something we should at least examine within other scientific systems, especially ones that have this sort of, ivory tower barrier to feedback from other folks.
yeah, that's true. At least like let's take taxonomy out of it, right? The concept of having specific data quality flags. Like I think there's an issue with the lat long, right? Like that I think could be really useful for um, improving data quality for biodiversity more broadly. We have pretty regular contact with folks from GBIF, and I haven't heard any discussion of them planning to do that. I think we probably would have heard if that was on their
Yeah, no, I'm one of the crusaders in that realm. I'm always telling
yeah.
people we should figure out a way to do this, and so now I'm bringing it up again here. We'll figure it out eventually.
Cool. Well, to your app question, um, we there's a few reasons that we started on a new app. One is that our Android app and our iOS app look quite different. And I mean, they're if you're pretty savvy, like you can see the similarities, but the Android app has a lot more features than the iOS app. And we've just for years, been really struggling with that. And from the perspective of teaching other people how to use iNaturalist, it will be much easier if those two apps look the same. The other piece of this is that I would say that um, our our mobile apps for iNaturalist were never really designed, really. They haven't changed in a long time. And with our Seek app, it actually was designed. It's much simpler. It is more popular. And what we have tried to do is take lessons that we learned from Seek and apply them to a redesign of the iNaturalist app. And this includes thinking very carefully about what are the barriers to someone downloading this app and then becoming a contributor to the community, an active participant. And so right now, we're working through three specific stages. We want people, first of all, to download the app and have a good identification experience, get a useful initial suggestion. Then secondly, we want them to have the satisfaction of collection, a virtual collection, and so they can just have it saved on their phone, a record of the thing that they saw, and have like a pretty view of it that they can look back at. Then thirdly, we want to, only after they've collected a few things and are like getting hooked on collection, then think about contributing to iNaturalist and sharing that more broadly. And at that point, then we want to nudge people to create an account and upload to iNaturalist. But nobody likes to be hit with a prompt immediately when you first downloaded an app. Nobody likes to create an account right away. So we're just trying to be very intentional about thinking through these different stages and trying to bring more people along.
Cool. Thanks for that. Let me just mention that Carla McAuliffe had to leave, but she chairs ESIP's education committee, and it sounds like she's hoping to connect the education folks associated with ESIP with you, Carrie. So just to note that. And Raleigh, you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
Hi, it's great to see you, Carrie. Really
Yeah.
enjoyed both of the presentations. So actually, this is a question for you, Carrie. The AI vision model enhanced with the geo model is really cool. At the same time, there are other, like now on my iPhone, I can just like take a photo and it has the like embedded AI feature, and there's Google Lens. And so I'm curious, like, in the context of those other tools that exist for identification, like, how that's affecting what you all are doing, and yeah, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, part of the challenge that we have is that, you know, directly or indirectly, like iNaturalist is what makes that possible, right? Like most of the open biodiversity information that's out there is from iNaturalist. So that's kind of like a hard and like complicated story to tell, but like that stuff wouldn't be possible without iNaturalist. Um, so what we need to do is make sure that people see that iNaturalist is not just an identification app and convey the value of contributing to science, of being part of a community, and and the awesome impact that you can have for biodiversity through that deeper level of participation. Because yes, if you only care about the name of something, then your iPhone can do that pretty well now for the most common species. But if you, we hope that that we will increase our sort of brand awareness of iNaturalist as the place to go. Like we want iNaturalist to be the nature app that everyone has in their pocket. And the existing apps that we have right now, we think are Seek is that in some ways, but Seek doesn't bring people deeper into that contribution piece, in part because it has a lot of limitations. It was created as a privacy conscious, kid safe app, and there's really like big barriers to making Seek not that. And there's a lot of value that people find in that. So we're trying to take those lessons, apply them to iNaturalist more broadly, and see the value, convey the value of deeper contribution than you can get from Siri.
If I could ask a follow-up question, I think this raises a bigger issue, which is that a lot of times folks interface with data sets that have been well curated through, countless hours of volunteer and scientist time, are through these commercial tools like, Google Scholar. People are like, oh, I can just find it on Google Scholar, like with regard to scholarly literature, and they're forgetting, well, that was like, authors writing papers and editors, reviewing reviewers, et cetera, and the whole publication network and data site and Crossref and so on. But all they see is like, oh, well, there's Google Scholar. And so like the value of those underlying resources that led to that are not fully appreciated. So I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I'm just like musing out loud, like how do we show the world like all of this underlying work that has gone into what often the public is just viewed as like, oh, I could just Google that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think you're right that it's a shared challenge.
And iNaturalist is a 501c3. I'm not sure whether or not Carrie mentioned that, but they are relying on support from people who actually choose to not just use it, but kick in some dollars too, which I try to do on a very modest scale. But you
Thank
do
you,
have a
Steve.
very finite budget, I know, and you do an amazing amount with what you have. So, Steve, I see you have your hand up, and then I have a couple of things I want to mention, but I'll let Steve go first.
Sure. So I have a thought in response to Raleigh's comment, and then also another question for Carrie. So for Raleigh, I think that that credit tracking is it's probably being a little too sensational to say that it's like a pandemic in science, but like it's really a big problem. Like we are really bad as scientists at making sure that people give credit to each other. So Carrie touched on the GBIF citation effort, which is really, it's an effort in the sense that there's people who are heavily involved manually curating those resources and reaching out to people when they find something that is sort of poorly cited. So oftentimes, people will say, "Oh, I got this from gbif.org," when there was actually a DOI that they could have cited specifically. And that happens all the time for like museum collections and other data sets too, a sort of casual thing rather than a machine trackable thing. And I think this community here at ESIP appreciates why machine actionability is so important for helping coordinate that information. But I think so beyond that too, with respect to iNaturalist within GBIF, there are feedback mechanisms for saying, hey, I disagree with this particular observation. And so because of iNat's how prolific that data is, there are some additional sort of prompts with iNat to say, hey, make sure you go back to the iNaturalist community and talk about it there. They have a place to give this feedback. Like we as GBIF can't do anything about it directly. But as node managers and parts of the GBIF network, we're always sort of, it's people who are mitigating that sort of brand, I don't know what you call it, like brand creep, where like all of a sudden iNaturalist data becomes GBIF data, and we're trying to say, look, we literally did nothing to this data. All we did was show it on a different website, and so I think people are a big part of that. Is and you could say it's education, you could say whatever, but I think as a community we need to be vigilant there. But then my question for Carrie, sorry, I guess I could pause. I don't know, Raleigh, if that sparked any sort of response, but.
Oh, that was a super helpful and interesting and challenging response. It sounds like a huge challenge that we face.
Yeah. And with respect to the NSF, I know like I'm always hammering on people like, make sure you put your funding grants, like please, if the funders know what happened with their money, then everybody gets more money. It's like if it's easy to show, then we can do that. Carrie, my question for you is, there are, especially within GBIF, there are literally dozens of papers saying, hey, like, look at all these biases in the data, especially with respect to like spatial sampling or taxonomic sampling, preference for charismatic fauna and things like that. It's maybe outside the purview of iNaturalist, but as the engagement officer, is there efforts to try to get people to say, hey, walk a little further away from that road? Or I know that, like for me, I'm guilty of like on the Mississippi River, there's black willow trees everywhere. I've maybe taken one picture of a black willow tree, but like anytime I see like a snake, I'm like, whoa, this is super cool, So yeah, do you all try to help people overcome those biases as they're collecting information?
So I would say that the sort of overwhelming thing about iNaturalist is that people don't, you got to give people like a clear starting place, and being able to tell people like just walk out your door and take a picture of like any wild living thing. Most people find that overwhelming to the point of being not actionable, right? And so I would say that we're still more focused on trying to get people to take those initial steps, um, and and not trying to overwhelm or confuse people with messaging about them trying to overcome their own observer biases for different types of organisms or for different types of locations. I would say that the ways that we think about trying to um, message how we might try to mitigate some of the things, those things are maybe like encouraging people to look for common species near them that maybe they haven't seen yet. That's one of the things we're trying to figure out how to do in the context of the new app, right? Like these are species that have been seen near you. Can you find them? Or sometimes with our more involved community, there'll be sort of gap filling exercises, right? Like somebody will look at a map and be like, oh, like that county has hardly any observations. Like I'm taking a road trip. I'm gonna go, I'm gonna stop at some parks I see on the map, right? And try and fill in those gaps. So I would say like the sort of gap filling piece is more where we're going. We're specifically going to try that a little bit in Canada this year in partnership, and I would say partnerships are the other main way that we're trying to do that through finding and supporting, and just I say supporting like very modestly, it- trying to support these organizations that want to use iNaturalist, that have connections in these places, because we're never going to be able to do it with just the small iNat team. It really takes a lot more boots on the ground, so to say.
If I could kind of hop on this, Carrie, you mentioned the BioBlitz concept, where basically you're deploying people to like find everything they can find, you know, literally every species within a finite area. I threw in chat earlier City Nature Challenge, but Steve, I think that partly, you know, responds to your question. So it's leveraging the iNat platform. You know, it wouldn't work without iNat, but thanks to the existence of iNat. But that's getting like a friendly competition globally. I think it was over 200 metro areas globally last year participated in.
Over 500.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's friendly competition, but it does get people out there, and you'll see people everything they can find, whether it's common or unusual or whatever. So I think that's a really powerful thing that it's been growing by leaps and bounds. So
Coming up at the end of April, if
yeah, so
anyone wants to mark your calendars.
for sure. And one other concept that, you know, is kind of powerful, that I believe Dan Jansen originated this, maybe even back in the 1980s in Costa Rica, but the idea of an all taxa biodiversity inventory, or an ATBI. And that in turn spawned the BioBlitz concept, but BioBlitzes by definition are very short in duration. ATBIs are like forever. And the one that I know about that's the most impressive is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And they've been doing amazing work there. So that's National Park Service and a lot of outside folks trying to find every species that occurs in the park. And they've discovered a lot of new species. That they've found things that were previously undescribed, unknown to science. So really, really cool stuff going on. But so much of it is enabled by the existence of iNaturalist. I have a couple other things
I
I
see
might go ahead.
Kelsey has her hand up.
Yeah, I was about to turn to Kelsey.
Cool.
Indeed. Yeah. Kelsey, take it away.
Sure, thanks. This has been really fun and very inspiring. So one of the things that I was thinking about is how Carrie was talking about how there are sort of like steps to involvement and steps to get users comfortable. And then, so it was sort of like, you know, our first goal is just getting people to use the app, right? And they're like baby steps to using the app. Like, just, can you make an observation? Then will you make a like a user profile? Then will you contribute to iNaturalist? And then, you know, Steve Formell highlighted the efforts to try to cut down on spatial and taxonomic bias. So I was thinking about this, you know, from like a user experience, and how like Duolingo kind of gamifies the experience. And I was wondering if that's something on your radar, where it sort of is like, you know, rewarding people somehow for doing these things, like earning badges, or if that's like something on your radar, and if you're kind of thinking about it in that trajectory.
Yeah, so our Seek app does have badges. Actually, is anyone use Seek? Can you do the raise hand thing if any Seek lovers in the audience? Raleigh, cool. Well, so maybe you can tell us in chat which badges you've got. But gamification is really powerful. And it's like a dark magic that you have to do very intentionally. and certain people are sort of more inclined to it than others. Uh, so we are thinking about it. And certainly we talk about Duolingo as a great source of inspiration. I think that probably our first little foray into what we sort of like rewards in the context of iNaturalist will be like very personal little like celebratory screens, like congratulations, you made your first observation. Congratulations, your observation is research grade. Congratulations, you found 10 different species. Things like that are like Seek, very, very personal things. But yeah, we have our team has recently grown. We are 18 people now. And the what's been exciting to me about iNaturalist for so long, but also simultaneously frustrating, is that there's still so much that we could be doing. And I still feel like we've barely scratched the surface in terms of, looking at these powerful commercial apps that have these massive, orders of magnitude larger teams supporting them, and all the cool things that we can do, hopefully, as we grow with more support.
Yeah, thank you.
Carrie, well, one quick anecdote. I have a friend who volunteers working with sort of a global expert on spiders, and their initial reaction to INAT when I started talking about it, probably about 5 years ago, was, "That's no good," and it was like, no, you can't identify a spider, just based on a picture, and this is like not useful. And it's been interesting to watch their thinking evolve over time to where they're kind of starting to get it now. And one of the things I pointed out to them was, well, look, at a minimum, you might discover some new collecting localities from INAT data. Like, you might not think that the observations are correct, but you might not have known about this place that someone with boots on the ground has found that has a bunch of spiders. So maybe you'd like to go there and apply your professional capabilities. So they've really evolved, and I think they're much more positive about INAT now than they started with. So that's been kind of fun to watch for
Yeah, I
me.
love the converted skeptics. They're sometimes they're the best evangelists.
Yeah, I think we're getting there with these folks out in Denver.
Yeah, and there I didn't really go into it, but there's of course some species where it's like basically impossible from a photo unless you've got a dissecting scope and have, dissected the spider genitals. Sometimes it is basically impossible to be able to tell different species apart, but the iNaturalist taxonomy can accommodate that because
Yep.
you can just go to family level or just go to genus level. And we've got a little box that I didn't mention, but it's in the screenshot that like you can say like this observation can't be, this identification can't be improved further.
Yes, and I'm going to turn to Steve in a moment, but let me just sort of put on the table, if we still have a tiny bit of time, I'm hoping maybe you can mention one or two innovative secondary uses of INAT data. I know you just gave a presentation on phenology 2 days ago, but that's sort of discretionary for you. But let me first give Steve a chance since he has his hand up. And then before we close out, maybe, there's a minute or two for you to talk about interesting secondary uses. But Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight something that, well, actually, this is almost a secondary, what's the word, like sort of an unforeseen
Yeah.
benefit of iNaturalist, which is that almost, I think, depending on who you believe, let's say 30 to 50% of the images that are linked to from GBIF data end up in dead links. And it's because people, restructure websites and things like that, basically because images don't have persistent identifiers. iNaturalist, at least as far as I know, doesn't have that problem. And so this conundrum of how do people host images and share them as data, iNaturalist has already figured that out. And so I think, again, something that could be learned from the rest of the scientific community.
So part of the reason that we have some stability is because we're part of the Amazon Open Data Program. And so Amazon covers the hosting costs for our images that are licensed with a Creative Commons license, which is about 2/3 of our photos. However, we did break a bunch of links when when we entered that program, because we had to like make a new S3 bucket when we did that. And so there was a period of time there where like, if you were we updated our GBIF links pretty promptly, but there were times where you could like find some broken links. So we haven't been immune either. Um, but it's basically because of some generous in-kind support that we're pretty stable now. So we hope that that generous in-kind support will continue. I can pull up my handy bonus slides and go through a few examples, including one of the ones that was mentioned the other day in the webinar about phonology that I did, which I think somebody dropped a link to the recording in chat already. So this is just a cool example of how they used iNaturalist observations of flowering as well as non-flowering Joshua trees to reconstruct a whole, over a century of climate change impacts on Joshua trees, which was pretty neat. I'm just gonna go through a few other cool examples. Um, some of those are multiple times. Okay.
And these bonus slides are sitting in the presentation in the folder, so anyone could look at all of them later, at your convenience.
Yeah, so here's one. Here's an example of a group that's using iNaturalist to collect data for a very specific conservation purpose, which is advocating for safe crossings for newts that are trying to breed. This, I think, was just on the radio again yesterday, I heard. I haven't even looked it up yet, but someone texted me. So my 11-year-old daughter refers to these as pedestrians, these poor newts that are trying to cross the road and getting hit by cars. So there are, in a few different places, folks who go out regularly and make iNaturalist observations, unfortunately, of a lot of dead newts. So it's very sad to see their observations. But they've been using this to advocate for places where there should be underpasses created or temporary road closures and things like that. Oh, I passed one that I wanted to highlight. Oh yeah, here's an example of seahorse observations being a crucial part for several new IUCN Red List assessments for a bunch of species. I don't think I have a slide on it, but there's also a really cool observation or cool story of what I would call observation bycatch, which is like the other things that are in the picture. So someone discovered that if you look at this one species of seahorse, I wish I had the slide up, but I don't. There's like these little worms that you can see in the background, like sticking out of the coral, and people hadn't recorded these particular what are they called? Polychaete worms for like 50 or 60 years or something. They thought they might be extinct, and it turns out they're hanging out in a bunch of the background of a bunch of these iNaturalist observations of seahorses. So I'll have to make a slide about that.
Super cool. Well, Carrie, we've hit the magic hour here, but I want to thank both you and Steve for fabulous presentations. I think you have a bunch of people who are eager to start either using or using more iNaturalist, based on some traffic I've seen in chat. And obviously I'm biased. I just think it's an amazing, wonderful thing. Oh, Sarah has, oh, okay. Her hand went up and down again. But thank
Can I
you.
give a final plug, Steve?
Yes.
So we're currently hiring our first communications role, a senior communications manager. And if you know someone who's good at telling short visual stories, we have an absolute fire hose of amazing impacts coming out of iNaturalist, and we really need help telling those stories. So that position will only be open until noon on February 5th. And please tell folks who might be interested to apply. You can find the link on our website.
Good plug. And you mentioned action again, and circling back to the theme of the meeting, from innovation to action. I think we're beginning to get just a tiny sense of all of the conservation actions, as well as other actions that iNaturalist can help to stimulate. So just really amazing. Well, I would like to, in addition to thanking the speakers, and Steve mentioned Abby Benson, Abby played a catalytic role for getting this session organized, as did Megan Orlando, whom he also mentioned. And I want to thank all of the ESIP staff for the wonderful support. And Susan, I hope you're feeling better. I know that you're on this session. Susan's the executive director of ESIP. So with that, we just barely went over, but unless there's any final parting shots, we are adjourned. I don't see anyone leaping. So thanks to all, and thanks to the participants, wonderful session.